They mocked the blind farmer who dared return to reclaim his land, laughed at the whistle around his neck, sneered at his silence. But when danger came riding with fire in its eyes, they discovered his horses didn't need eyes to see or mercy to act. In Boone Hollow, legacy isn't bought, it's earned. And sometimes the man they try to break is the one who teaches them how to stand. You think it's just a quiet farm. Listen closer. That whistle hasn't blown in weeks, but the horses are still watching. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sun beat down on the dusty town of Willow Creek, turning the wooden boards of the main street into a shimmering path of heat and tension. It was auction day, and folks from miles around had come to witness who would lay claim to the last parcel of disputed land along the edge of Boone Hollow. The buzz of conversation filled the air, a mixture of speculation and gossip. As boots scuffed the dry earth and wagon wheels creaked to a stop, outside the sheriff's office, a rusty sign creaked in the hot wind, the words Willow Creek Land Authority barely visible through the dust. The auction was set to begin in 1 hour, and already the town square brimmed with ranchers, opportunists, and a handful of troublemakers. Looking to cash in on someone else's dream, from the saloon's batwing doors emerged a pack of them, the Black Hollow Gang. Led by Clay Maddox, a wiry man with sun-scorched skin and a twisted grin, they strutted across the road like they owned every inch of it. His men followed close behind. Buck with the scar over his left eye, Jace with a shotgun slung low, and the youngest, Lonnie, barely old enough to shave but mean enough to shoot without blinking. "You see that, boys?" Clay said, jerking his chin toward the auction board. "Last parcel in Boone Hollow, prime land, water access, trees for days, and we got enough cash to buy it 10 times over." The others chuckled, lighting cigars and spitting tobacco into the dirt. Their horses tethered nearby, stamped and snorted, almost sensing the arrogance of their masters. "Ain't nobody gonna outbid us," Buck muttered. "Only fool who tried last week ain't walked right since." Clay's smile widened. "Long as Sheriff Langley don't get in our way again." Across the square, standing still as stone beneath a weathered pine, was Ezekiel Boone. Some called him Zeke, others whispered the name with a touch of unease. He was tall and lean, wearing a coat faded by sun and time, the brim of his hat low enough to cast his face in shadow. But it wasn't the coat or hat that caught attention, it was the milky haze of his eyes, the slight tilt of his head, as if listening to sounds others couldn't hear. A long scar ran down his cheek, like lightning etched in flesh. He was blind. A boy no older than 12 stood beside him, hands buried in the mane of a towering black stallion that stood so still it might have been carved from obsidian. "Zeke," the boy whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "You sure about this? They ain't gonna let you just walk in and buy the land?" Zeke didn't move, his lips pressed tight, jaw set. One hand rested on the saddle, fingers lightly drumming in rhythm, almost like he was thinking through his fingertips. From across the street, Clay noticed them. He let out a short bark of laughter. "Well, I'll be damned that the ghost of Boone Hollow come to life." He turned to his men. "Ain't that the blind farmer who lost his land 2 years ago? What's he thinking? Buying it back with what? Pity coins?" Buck grinned. "Heard he went soft in the head after the fire. Maybe he thinks the horse is gonna place the bid." They laughed loud enough for Zeke to hear, but the old farmer gave no reaction. Only the horse's ears twitched, swiveling toward the sound, the stallion's eyes fixed on the gang. "That old man don't even know where he's standing," Jay scoffed. "He sure as hell don't know who he's standing against." Sheriff Ada Langley stood near the town hall steps, arms crossed, eyes locked on Zeke with a flicker of something that looked a lot like worry. She knew the Black Hollow Gang. She knew Zeke, too. Not many people remembered the name Ezekiel Boone from the war, but she did, and she knew he hadn't come for charity. The crowd thickened. Dust clung to boots and collars. The air tasted of sun, sweat, and something else underneath, the scent of a reckoning long overdue, and Zeke Boone. Blind but unbowed, simply waited. Not one soul noticed his thumb tracing the edge of a small brass whistle that hung around his neck. Not yet, but they would. The town of Briar Gulch sat nestled between scorched canyon ridges and rolling scrubland, a fading dot on the edge of the frontier. Dust clung to every surface like a second skin, and the only thing sharper than the sun overhead was the tension, thickening in the air. By mid-morning, townsfolk had begun to gather near the old auction platform just outside the general store. Drawn by the promise of spectacle or conflict, in places like Briar Gulch, the two were often the same. The day's main attraction was no traveling show or preacher's sermon. It was a land auction, just under 50 acres of wild pasture near the southern ridge, untouched since the war, fertile and filled with spring water, prime territory. Rumor had it the land once belonged to a soldier turned recluse, a man who vanished years ago, leaving nothing behind but fencing posts and whispers. No one expected Ezekiel Boone to return, which is why, when the first murmurs rippled through the crowd, the townsfolk turned as one toward the narrow trail that wound in from the southeast. There, slowly making his way up the main road, came a figure hunched against the sun. A wide-brimmed hat shielded his face. One hand rested lightly on the shoulder of a boy no older than 12, who led him forward with cautious steps. In the other hand, Ezekiel carried nothing. No cane, no weapon. Just the rhythm of his boots against dirt and the jangle of tack from the tall black horse that followed close behind. The whispers grew louder. That can't be. He's blind. I thought he was dead. Zeke Boone, that old ghost. Ezekiel said nothing. His face was a mask of weathered leather, the sort that bore the map of 100 sandstorms and half as many regrets. A ragged gray beard hid the lower half of his jaw, and a wide scar ran from beneath his left ear down to where his collar disappeared into a faded brown duster. His eyes, when they caught the light, were cloudy and pale. Empty Kinheven. See where he's going? A rancher muttered aloud, drawing laughter from a group of young men leaning against a water trough. The boy leading Ezekiel Caleb, the stable hand sun-tensed but said nothing. He'd been asked to guide the farmer into town, and he was doing exactly that. Still, he felt the sting of every stare, every mocking grin, aimed not just at Zeke, but at anyone fool enough to walk into a storm without a gun drawn. They reached the edge of the square. The crowd parted just enough to let them through. And then, as if by some unspoken rule, silence fell. Ezekiel stopped walking. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the weight of bodies shifting in the dirt, to boots scuffing wood, to the telltale metallic rattle of a holster being unlatched. The black stallion beside him snorted once and pawed the ground. Rear of the crowd, a sharp voice cut through the stillness. "Well, I'll be damned. You really are alive." The voice belonged to Clay Maddox, leader of the Black Hollow gang, sunburned and arrogant, with a twisted grin that showed more gold than enamel. His fingers played loosely along the butt of the revolver at his hip as he stepped forward, flanked by 3 of his men. All armed, all grinning. "Zeke Boone," Clay said, voice loud and mocking. "Back from the dead and looking to buy land he can't even see. Tell me, old man Deed, anyone read you the signs? This land's claimed. You're walking into somebody else's deal." Ezekiel didn't answer, didn't flinch, didn't even turn his head. Clay chuckled and turned toward the crowd, raising his hands as if narrating a joke for an invisible audience. "You all see this? A blind man walks into a gunfight, thinking he's got a prayer. Only thing he'll end up buying today is a coffin." Laughter rippled through the Outlaws. Some townsfolk forced polite smiles. Others turned away, ashamed. Caleb looked up at Zeke, hoping for something: anger, fear, a reaction. But the old man was calm, still. His fingers brushed the small brass whistle hanging from a leather cord around his neck. Just once, then dropped to his side again. Clay stepped closer, close enough to smell whiskey on his breath. "You got something to say, Boone? Or do you let the boy do your talking now?" Zeke turned his head slightly in Clay's direction. "No need to speak," he said, voice low, gravel thick, but even some things speak for themselves. The black stallion shifted its weight behind him, muscles tense, eyes alert, and though no one yet knew it, the moment had shifted. The forgotten farmer had come home, and with him came something more. The saloon's swinging doors flapped lazily in the dry wind, creaking with a rhythm that matched the piano's broken tune. Inside, the light dimmed to amber as smoke hung thick in the air, curling through rafters and clinging to the worn velvet. Of the card tables, laughter course and reckless rose like steam from a boiling pot. Bubbling out of the back corner where the Black Hollow gang had made themselves at home, Clay Maddox leaned back in his chair, boots propped on a second one, as he swirled whiskey in a chipped glass. His eyes, sharp and mean beneath a battered hat, danced with amusement as he recounted the scene outside. You should have seen his face sore. What's left of it, pale as bone, all scarred up, standin' there like some ghost come knockin'. At the gate, Clay snorted. That blind bastard really thinks he's gonna walk up and outbid me for Boone Hollow. Buck spat into a spittoon with a lazy twang. Hell, maybe he's got gold stashed under that horse of his. Big ugly brute, ain't it? Jace chuckled, wiping his shotgun with an oiled rag. He'll need more than gold. He'll need eyes. And lungs. Once we stomp him out, the saloon girls gave them wide berth, staying toward the front of the bar. Even the barkeep, a man who'd served during bar brawls and shootouts, kept his eyes lowered while refilling Clay's glass. No one in Willow Creek liked the Black Hollow gang, but no one had the courage to say it. Not when their gold spoke. Louder than bullets, and their bullets often did the talking. Still, Lonnie piped up, tapping ash from his cigarette. We sure that's the Boone everyone talks about? I heard stories. Said he was some war man, taught horses to read maps or some such nonsense. Clay rolled his eyes. He taught M to die on command. Maybe. Don't matter what he used to be. Now he's just another fool limping into my business. Buck leaned forward. What if he don't limp so easy? What if he's still got something left in him? Clay's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew colder. Then he dies tired. They roared again with laughter. The sound bounced off the saloon walls, filling the room like a flood mockery dipped in whiskey and bravado. But beneath the surface, there was something else, something none of them wanted to name. They had seen the stallion, seen how it didn't flinch, didn't rear, didn't move, unless the blind man knew that wasn't normal. And they had seen the man too. Pale eyes didn't mean vacant ones. Zeke hadn't shown fear, not even when they mocked him. Clay knocked back his whiskey and slammed the glass down hard enough to chip the rim. We're gonna end this before it starts. When that auction bell rings, I want the crowd to scared to lift a finger for him. He stood, adjusting his belt, checking the weight of the pistol on his hip. The others followed suit. Boys, he said, voice low and deliberate. Let's remind Willow Creek who runs Boone Hollow now. As they swaggered toward the doors, the laughter faded. Even the piano stopped playing. The saloon grew still like the breath of the town itself had caught in its throat. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere not far off, a single whistles. Echo hung briefly in the air, like a bird's call swallowed by silence. But the men inside didn't hear it. Not yet. Sheriff Ada Langley stood with her back to the sun, arms folded tightly across her chest as the shadow of the courthouse stretched long and lean across the packed dirt street. Her eyes, ice blue and unblinking, followed the figures swaggering. Out of the saloon, the Black Hollow gang was many things, brutal, reckless, and untouchable by most, but they weren't subtle, and Clay Maddox's face wore that particular smile she'd come to recognize over the years, the one that meant someone was about to bleed. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for the iron on her hip, just waited. They passed her with barely a glance. Clay tipped his hat mockingly. Mornin', Sheriff, Ada replied without turning her head. Still a few hours from morning, Maddox, he chuckled. Sun rises fast in Willow Creek. And sets faster, she replied. Clay's boots clacked against the dry boards of the general store porch, the gang trailing like vultures, circling carrion. She watched them disappear down the alley toward the livestock pens before turning her attention back to the square. There he was. Ezekiel Boone stood like a monument and moving, unfazed. He held the reins of the black stallion in one hand, the other resting against the pommel of the saddle. Beside him, young Caleb was nervously shifting from foot to foot, glancing at Zeke, then back at the thinning crowd. Folks weren't sure whether to stay and see what happened next or leave. Before things got messy, Ada stepped off the porch and made her way across the square. The crowd parted for her like oil from water. She stopped a few paces from Zeke and studied him for a long moment. Never thought I'd see your face in town again, she said. Zeke didn't move. Didn't think it mattered what I saw. Ada exhaled slowly through her nose. You know what kind of hornet's nest you're pokin'? Not pokin', he said, just reclaiming what was never theirs. She glanced at the boy, Caleb gave a half shrug as if to say he was just as confused as everyone else, but unwilling to walk away, Ada stepped closer. "Clay Maddox is mean Zeke, meaner now than he was before. Got his hooks in the mayor, the bank, even some of my deputies. You bid on that land, and you're not just fighting him, you're fighting the whole damn system." Zeke tilted his head toward the sound of her voice. "Didn't come to fight, just came to finish." Ada sighed. "You're blind. You don't even know how many guns'll be pointed your way if you so much as lift a hand." "I don't need to see a gun to know where it's aimed." The stallion snorted, almost as if in agreement. His tail flicked once, ears pinned forward. Watching Ada hesitated. She'd known Zeke before the war, before the scars, before the silence. He used to speak in sermons, not whispers. He used to ride like thunder and laugh like he was made of sunlight. But this version of him, he was quieter, colder, sharper. "Whatever you're planning," she said, "it's not too late to walk away." Zeke lifted his chin slightly. "It's too late for them." A chill passed through Ada that had nothing to do with the weather. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Then I'll do what I can to keep it from becoming a massacre." Zeke gave no reply, just raised one hand and touched the whistle at his neck. It gleamed gold in the sun, a soft glint like the first glimmer off a drawn blade. Ada turned away, her voice low as she walked. "God help them if that whistle means what I think it means." And across the square in the alley where no one could see them, Clay Maddox was loading fresh rounds into his revolver, because he had no intention of letting Ezekiel Boone leave. That auction standing, not without a reminder of who owned Willow Creek now. The sun had shifted slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across Willow Creek as the town buzzed like a nest of hornets before a storm. The auction stage had been swept, chairs placed for the council and auctioneer, and a battered flag hung limp in the windless heat. But despite all the preparations, the center of attention was not the stage. It was the man standing near the old hitching post, silent as stone. Ezekiel Boone hadn't moved in over 15 minutes. He stood with the stillness of a statue, one hand resting on Widowmaker's reins, the other relaxed at his side, fingers occasionally twitching as if tapping out a code no one else could read. His hat cast his face in shadow, and the brass whistle at his neck glinted with each sway of the breeze. A quiet beacon in the storm of rising tension. People kept their distance. Not out of disrespect, out of uncertainty. They didn't know what to make of him. Caleb sat cross-legged near the horse's flank, nervously picking at a thread in his sleeve. Every so often he looked up at Zeke, trying to read his expression, but it was unreadable. Calm, quiet, unbothered. "Zeke, the boy," finally asked, his voice hushed. "You sure about this? I mean, really sure?" Zeke didn't respond right away. His head remained slightly tilted, listening not just to the boy, but to the crunch of boots, the jingle of harnesses, the click of rifles being checked in shadows. "I came here with nothing left to lose," he said at last. "That's more power than any gun gives a man." Caleb swallowed hard. "They're saying Maddox's boys are going to start something that you won't even hear at Cumin." "I'll hear it," Zeke said simply. He reached up and slowly ran a hand down Widowmaker's neck. The stallion shifted slightly, pressing against him as if to remind the world whose side he was on. His coat shimmered like oil beneath the sun, muscles rippling beneath flesh that had known war. "Just like his master, people keep waiting for the sound of a gun to start a fight," Zeke said softly. "But I've learned. The real silence comes just before the first move. That's when the world holds its breath." Caleb tilted his head. "You mean now?" Zeke didn't answer. His fingers found the whistle again. Not to blow it, just to feel it. To remind himself of the years it had hung there, unused. Waiting it wasn't just a tool, it was a memory. That whistle had once meant charge. It had meant run, retreat, encircle. Wait, it was language carved from war, drilled into beasts most men thought untrainable. But Zeke hadn't trained through force. He had trained with trust. Widowmaker had been born wild, a stallion no soldier could ride. But Zeke hadn't broken him. He'd listened to him, fought beside him, bled beside him, and when the time came, Widowmaker had carried him out of hell. Now they stood together again. A few yards away, townsfolk whispered from doorways. Some said Zeke was cursed. Others said he was just stubborn. But a few, a precious few, remembered. A scarred rancher, Near the jail, leaned on his cane and muttered, "That's Ezekiel Boone, all right." Took down a whole flanking column at Shale Pass with nothing but 2 horses and a smoke signal. Man's not blind, he just sees different. Back near the general store, Clay Maddox stood under the awning with his gang, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He watched the way Zeke didn't fidget, didn't react, didn't show the slightest flicker of nerves. "He's not bluffing," Clay muttered. JACE looked sideways at him. "So, we still got the drop on him. He can't even see us." Clay's jaw tightened. "No, but that damn horse can." The laughter from earlier had faded. Now, even the outlaws watched with wary eyes, like they couldn't quite figure out whether they were dealing with a man or a legend. "Come back to settle his debts?" the auctioneer called out across the square. "1 hour till bidding begins." The voice echoed, but it couldn't break the strange quiet that had settled around Ezekiel Boone. He hadn't spoken since, and yet, somehow, he'd already said more than anyone else dared. His silence wasn't fear, it was promise. Long before the dust settled over Boone Hollow, before the fire, before the war, stole more than just lives. There were whispers about the Boone family, particularly Ezekiel. Folks around Willow Creek had always kept one eye on that patch of fertile ridge and one on the man who called it home. Back then, Zeke Boone was a mystery, even in the daylight. He was never loud, never boastful, but his presence filled a room like thunder in the distance, quiet, heavy, certain. The stories began with his horses. Some claimed Zeke could speak to them, not in words, but in something older, something buried in the bones of men who had spent too long in the saddle. He didn't ride them into battle. He rode with them as if they were part of his own breath. And then the war came. That's when the legends really started, they said. Captain Boone rode into the heart of enemy fire with nothing but a curved blade and a whisper. Said his horses carried wounded men across miles of blood-soaked ground, never once needing reins. They said Zeke led a detachment across Raven's Hollow at night, with only his whistle and the moonlight to guide him, and came out the other side without losing a single man. One tale told of how he circled an entire fort with only 3 horses, and misdirection, convincing the enemy they were surrounded. The fort surrendered without a shot. Another claimed he trained a stallion to step over mines, not avoid them. Step over them, no one ever saw how he did it. They just knew he could. When the war ended, so did the stories for a while. Zeke came home to Boone Hollow, quieter than ever. Built his home again with bare hands and buried memories. Folks gave him space. They respected the silence. They respected the scars. Then came the fire, then the blindness, and then he vanished until now. Inside the barber shop, an old man named Silas tapped his cane nervously against the floor as he watched from behind the curtained window. "That's him," he muttered to no one in particular. "By God, that's him," the young barber asked, distracted by the smell of his own burning cigar. "Boone," Silas rasped. "Ezekiel Boone. You ever hear about Rattler's Crossing?" The barber shrugged. Silas grinned through yellowed teeth. "Figures, they don't teach no thine to you kids anymore." He took down an entire battalion with a formation of horses, lined them up like men, fired no shots, just had M stampede through enemy lines on his whistle. Horses moved like they were thinking, like they were angry. The barber laughed. "Sounds like a campfire tale." Silas turned, his smile gone. "Only reason I'm breathin' right now is because of him, so don't laugh." Elsewhere, at the blacksmith's, 2 ranch hands leaned against a post, watching the blind man and his stallion as if unsure whether they were looking at flesh or myth. "I thought he died in the fire." One of them whispered. The other, I heard, "The town let him burn. Took his land while he was still trying to crawl out. You think he's here to buy it back?" The first one snorted. "Don't think he's here to buy anything. He's here to make M remember." Back in the square, Zeke stood still. The sun had begun its slow descent, and shadows stretched farther across the dusty ground. The town pulsed with unease. Not fear, not yet, but the kind of hush that rolls in before a tornado breaks the ridge. Zeke's ears twitched at the sound of approaching boots. Widowmaker stirred but didn't move. The old man held up a calming hand, and the stallion stilled. Sheriff Langley appeared beside him again. "I've been hearing the stories," she said. "You planning on turning rumor into fact?" Zeke didn't smile, but there was something in his voice, like steel buried in velvet. Truth don't care what people remember, it just waits. Nodded once. Then, I guess it's about to stand up. As she turned to leave, Caleb looked up at Zeke, his voice barely more than breath. "Those stories," he whispered, "about what you did, the horses, the war, are they true?" Zeke's cloudy eyes didn't shift. "Some of them." Caleb hesitated. "Which ones?" The corner of Zeke's mouth tugged. "Not quite a smile. The ones that end with me still breathing." And so the legend stirred again, fed, not by fire or fame, but by a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command. Boone Hollow had a history, and its ghost had come home to write the final chapter. A single bell tolled from the courthouse tower, echoing across the square like a warning shot from the heavens. Noon, high sun, time for the auction. The crowd that had been milling about all morning now shifted with purpose, flowing like river. Water toward the raised wooden platform near the town's old meeting hall. Dust rose with every step, settling on shoulders, hats, and the trembling breath of anticipation. There was no laughter now, only murmurs. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a simple sale at the edge of the platform. A rotund man in a striped vest adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, standing on a crate just behind the podium. Jasper Cartwright, town clerk, auctioneer, and master of ceremonies when things were peaceful. He looked pale now, his usual bravado buried beneath sweat and nerves. "Citizens of Willow Creek," he called, voice thin but functional. "Today we gather for the auction of parcel number 9, also known as Boone Hollow. The land in question is located east of the South Ridge, containing 48 acres of mixed terrain, spring-fed with timber and pasture rights. As per Ordinance 17A, all bids are to be submitted verbally, witnessed by counsel and recorded by this office." A rustle moved through the crowd like wind through brush. Everyone already knew who was going to bid. The only question was, how ugly was it going to get? To the left of the platform, the Black Hollow gang lounged in plain sight, leaning against posts and railings like wolves wearing borrowed sheep's clothing. Clay Maddox stood in front, arms crossed over his chest, boots planted. A confident smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. His hand never strayed far from his pistol. Jace spun a coin between his fingers. Buck lit a cigar. Lonnie chewed on a splinter of wood and eyed the sheriff's office as if daring it to blink dot across from them. Standing in full sunlight was Ezekiel Boone. He hadn't moved since sunrise. His hat still shaded his face, but everyone knew those pale eyes were fixed forward, unblinking. Beside him, Widowmaker stood like a statue carved from coal, and Caleb shifted on his feet nervously, the only one in the square, who seemed aware that every second might be the moment when something snapped. Sheriff Ada Langley took her position near the stage. She was armed, of course. She always was. But today, her hand hovered closer to her holster than usual. The townsfolk were restless, and it wouldn't take much to turn tension into blood. "Opening bid," Cartwright called, glancing down at the paperwork with shaking hands, set at $500. "Silence, Dot. Then 500. Clay Maddox said, voice loud, proud, and cutting through the air like a knife through linen. Cash on hand, gasps rippled. That was enough to buy 5 horses or 2 barns. But Clay was making a point. Zeke didn't flinch. Cartwright hesitated, glanced at the sheriff, then at Zeke. "We have 500. "Do we have 501? Zeke said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It landed. In the square like a hammer dropped from heaven. There was no sarcasm in it, no challenge, just a statement of fact. Clay's jaw twitched. "You mocking me, Boone?" Zeke said nothing. Cartwright cleared his throat, nervous. We have 501. A stunned hush swept across the square. Someone coughed. A woman gasped. Caleb tugged Zeke's sleeve. "He's trying to price you out." But Zeke simply said, 1001. Clay stepped forward. "You don't have that kind of money, old man. You don't even have that kind of sight." Zeke didn't move. "Guess you'll have to wait and see." Maddox's eyes flared, but he held himself in check. "For now," Cartwright stammered, 1001. Going once. 1500, Clay growled. Cartwright blinked. 1500. "Do 11501, Zeke said, voice calm as ever. Clay barked. "A laugh." "What? You gonna bid me up $1 at a time till the sun sets? If that's what it takes, Zeke replied. I've got more time than you. The crowd buzzed louder. This wasn't a bidding war. It was a standoff with numbers and... Zeke wasn't blinking dot. Clay cursed under his breath. You got a death wish, Boone? Zeke didn't respond. But Widowmaker took one slow step forward, his hooves thudding like the tolling of a bell. That sound did more than words. Maddox stiffened. His gang fell silent. And in that moment, everyone knew. This auction wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about a man who had nothing left to lose. And a legacy he was willing to buy back with silence, patience, and, if necessary, blood. Cartwright raised his shaky hand. Tina won, going once. Clay's lip curled, going twice. Zeke raised a hand. Not high, just enough, and his fingers brushed the whistle. The crowd held its breath. Sold. Cartwright said, barely above a whisper, to Mr. Ezekiel Boone, and the world stood still. There was no cheer, no applause, only silence. A silence so dense it seemed to weigh on the shoulders of everyone present. Not even the birds dared to interrupt. Zeke's hand lingered near the brass whistle that hung from his neck. His posture, unchanged. Widowmaker stood motionless beside him, every muscle coiled, every breath deliberate. It was the stillness of a storm's eye, the quiet between thunderclaps. Clay Maddox stepped forward. His boots struck the dirt hard, one after the other, the echo a slow countdown to something inevitable. He didn't speak right away, and when he finally did, his voice was low, venomous, and tightly wound. You think this is over? He asked. You think this land's yours now? That we all just step aside because a blind man threw a few coins in the dirt? Zeke said nothing. Clay's nostrils flared. You don't understand what just happened. You just put yourself between me and my property. It was never yours, Zeke replied calmly. You only had it because no one stood up. Well, I'm standin' now, Clay growled. His hand twitched subtle. Fast but not fast enough. In a blur, Widowmaker lunged forward with a deafening snort, planting himself between Zeke and Maddox. His hooves dug deep into the soil, neck arched. Eyes wild and locked onto Clay's hand. Maddox froze. Not out of fear, not exactly. Out of recognition that horse hadn't just reacted, it had predicted that the crowd gasped. Caleb took a quick step back, heart pounding. He moved before Clay even touched his gun. Widowmaker pawed the ground once, twice. Dust curled in the air like smoke from a warning shot. Zeke finally stepped forward. His movement was calm, measured. I won this land fair. You know it, the council knows it, the law knows it. Clay's jaw tightened. You think the law's on your side? Zeke turned his head slightly toward Sheriff Langley, who stood nearby, hand hovering above her holster. I think some of it still is. Ada didn't speak, but she met Maddox's glare with steel in her eyes. Clay licked his lips and chuckled bitterly. You blind Boone. You don't see how this place really works anymore. Ain't about rules or fairness. It's about power. Who's got the grit to hold on when things get dirty? Zeke tilted his head. Then, let's get dirty. The moment cracked open like lightning splitting a tree. Clay went for his gun. He was fast, but the whistle was faster. A sharp, piercing blast rang through the air, one long note that shattered the silence and set off a chain reaction no one in town had ever seen before. Widowmaker reared hooves, slashing the air, letting out a shriek of fury that sent Clay stumbling back. From the stables at the far end of town came the thunder of hoofs to more stallions, unbridled, galloping down the main street with fire in their eyes. The crowd scattered. People screamed. Doors slammed shut. Children pulled into alleyways. The horses moved like shadows, weaving through chaos with military precision. They didn't buck. They didn't panic. They circled Clay's gang like wolves, cutting off exits, splitting them up. Jace raised his shotgun. But another whistle split the air, this one 2 short blasts. Widowmaker turned like a ghost and charged. The shotgun clattered to the ground. Buck tried to pull his revolver, but a flash of hooves caught him across the chest and sent him sprawling into a water trough. Lonnie screamed and ran for cover. Diving beneath a wagon, the crowd, what was left of it, watched with wide eyes and open mouths as a blind man stood still in the middle of town, his horses responding to every command like seasoned warriors. Clay found himself on the ground, choking on dust, staring up into the firelit eyes of Widowmaker, whose hoof hovered inches from his throat. Another whistle, one short, sharp note. The stallion stepped back. Clay scrambled to his feet, clothes torn, pride shattered, hand trembling. Around a pistol he never got the chance to draw. Zeke finally spoke again. "You want power, Maddox? That's what it looks like when it's earned." Clay backed away slowly, eyes darting from horse to horse. "You're not going to get away with this. You'll have to sleep sometime." "I do," Zeke said, "and when I do, they watch." He turned his face to the sheriff. "Ada?" She nodded slowly. "I saw the first move. If he draws again, I won't stop the next one." Clay spat into the dirt, humiliated. "This ain't over." Zeke didn't answer. He didn't have to, because for the first time in 2 years, Boone Hollow was his again, and everyone in Willow Creek knew. The blind farmer had just won the first round of a war he'd already finished in his mind. The town square lay quiet now, its silence marked not by peace, but by awe. People stood in doorways and leaned against beams, eyes wide and mouths slack, still trying to grasp what they had witnessed. No one moved to help Clay Maddox and his gang as they limped away, dragging bruised bodies and shattered pride behind them. They had come to intimidate. They had been dismantled, not with bullets, but with discipline, precision, and horses that moved like soldiers. Ezekiel Boone didn't say a word as he turned from the auction platform, his boots whispering across the dust. Widowmaker followed a half-step behind, his breathing even ears perked for the next command that might never come. The 2 other horses, Ghost Gray and Sun Gold, trailed them, perfectly spaced, perfectly calm, nearly jogging to keep pace. They've never seen anything like that. "I've never seen anything like that." Zeke said nothing. "You didn't even raise your voice," the boy continued. "They moved like they could see what you saw, like they knew what was coming." Zeke turned his head slightly. "They did." The boy blinked, but how? Zeke paused at the edge of the square. The sunlight caught the milky cloud of his eyes, but behind them there was sharpness, purpose, memory. "You listen to an animal long enough," he said quietly, "and it listens back." They reached the hitching post. Zeke didn't tie the reins. He simply placed his hand on Widowmaker's flank and gave a soft click with his tongue. The stallion dipped his head, waiting. Caleb hesitated. "You're really going back out there? To Boone Hollow?" Zeke nodded once. "But what if they follow?" Zeke adjusted the strap across his shoulder. "Then they'll find out why I trained more than just horses." He mounted with a smooth, practiced motion, legs swinging over with an ease that betrayed neither age nor blindness. Widowmaker shifted beneath him like a mountain coming to life. Caleb stared up at him. "You really think they'll come for the land again?" "They always come," Zeke said. "But this time, I'm ready." Ada approached then, her face serious but unreadable. "You just made more enemies than you had friends, Zeke. Maddox won't forget this." "He shouldn't," Zeke replied. "Neither should the town." She looked up at him, her voice lower now. "They saw what you did. Some of them will try to twist it, say it was a trick, say you used trained animals to scare them. But I saw something else." Zeke waited. "I saw the man who used to ride into fire without blinking, the one who taught soldiers to listen to silence. You came back different, but not lesser." He dipped his head in thanks. She stepped back. "Ride careful." With a soft whistle, this one a gentle rising tone, the horses turned in unison. They didn't rush, didn't gallop, just walked with purpose down the main street of Willow Creek, past the saloon, past the jailhouse, past people too stunned to speak. Caleb watched them go until the dust swallowed their silhouettes. One rancher removed his hat. A woman crossed herself. Somewhere, a baby began to cry, sensing, perhaps, the shift in air. The town's rhythm had changed. Boone Hollow was no longer a myth. It was a statement, a claim, and it had been reclaimed by the man who never needed eyes to see the truth. As Zeke rode out of town, the hills opened before him, golden windblown, whispering the songs of memory. Boone Hollow lay ahead, scarred, but waiting, and for the first time in years, it would welcome its rightful owner. No one followed him, not yet, but even if they did, Ezekiel Boone would be ready, because home was not a place you defend once, it was a place you defend always. The sun was lower now, casting its golden light over the hills like spilled honey. Zeke rode in silence, Widowmaker's steady hoofbeats the only sound across the ridge. It had been nearly 2 years since he last made this ride since. Fire and fury had chased him from the only home he'd ever known. Boone Hollow came into view slowly, cresting over the final hill like a ghost rising from the earth. The cabin was still there, though its roof sagged from weather and neglect. The wooden fencing that once circled the pasture lay broken in parts, half swallowed by tall grass. The barn blackened by fire, and time stood like a hollowed rib. Cage in the field, Zeke inhaled deeply. Smoke still lived in the soil, but so did memory. He dismounted without a word. Widowmaker stood still as ever, eyes sweeping the land as if recognizing their old domain. The other horses paced slowly toward the edge of the field, snorting softly, tails flicking. They remembered too. Zeke walked forward, boots crunching over brittle grass and charcoal. He stopped at the base of what once had been the porch now, a heap of warped boards and vines. A flat rock, worn smooth, it had once been the front step. He knelt beside it, laying his palm flat against its surface. "This is still mine," he whispered, not in defiance, in truth. Behind him, the horses moved, inspecting the perimeter as they'd been trained. Zeke rose and removed his coat, folding it neatly and setting it on a fallen post. The brass whistle hung free around his neck, gleaming in the evening light. He turned toward the barn. The door creaked as he opened it, the hinges protesting after years of rust. Inside, the air was thick with ash and dust. He took a careful step, then another. The floor moaned underfoot, but held, and there, in the shadows beneath, a tarp of old canvas, was the trunk. He knew it would still be there. He dropped to one knee and brushed the dust away. The latch clicked open with a groan. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and leather, lay the remnants of his past: war journals, maps, spare whistle codes, spare tack and reins, everything he'd kept in case this day ever came. And beneath it all, the ledger, the original land deed. Signed by his father, he touched it gently, then closed the trunk. The sound of hoofbeats pulled him back to the present. Widowmaker stood in the doorway, ears forward as if waiting for orders. Zeke stepped out, into the dying light. He walked to the broken fence and sat on a beam facing west. The sun hung just above the ridge, blood orange and unwavering. He didn't need to see it to know what it meant. He felt it in the way the wind moved differently, here more honest, less heavy. Boone Hollow wasn't just his again, it was. Awake, he spent the next hour in silence, patching a bit of the fence with what timber he could scavenge, not out of necessity but to make a mark, to say, "I'm here," when the light began to fade. He whistled, once low and steady. The horses gathered around him, calm and content. Need to speak? Boone Hollow had already listened, but still he offered a whisper to the breeze. "You're home now, and so am I." And for the first time in years, the hollow didn't feel empty, it felt whole. The quiet of Boone Hollow didn't last long by morning. The mist had settled low across the ridge, curling through trees and clinging to the remnants of fences like fingers. Birds chirped cautiously from the high branches, and a soft wind rustled the yellowing grass. It was peaceful, but not silent, because Zeke had been waiting. He'd risen before dawn, just as he always had when the land was still his. He'd fed the horses from the small stash of grain he'd kept buried behind the barn, retrieved water from the nearby spring still flowing, still clear, and walked the edges of the property by memory. Every dip, every rise, every break-in, the tree line was known to him. Not seen, but understood. Widowmaker stayed close, ever alert. The other 2 stallions, Valor and Flint, names earned, not given, patrolled the outer ring, their paths precise. They responded to subtle sounds Zeke made, tongue clicks, soft hums, coded whistles. This was not a farm anymore. It was a fortress with hooves. By mid-morning, Zeke had patched 2 sections of fence and cleared the overgrowth from the well. He stood at the edge of the barn, running a cloth along a rusted old bit. When he heard it, 3 riders not far off, but approaching fast. Zeke didn't react immediately. He finished polishing the bit and hung it back on its nail, then turned toward the tree line, eyes cloudy but locked forward. The hoofbeats grew louder. Widowmaker perked his ears, tail flicking once. He didn't move, not yet, but his muscles. tightened like a spring. Zeke gave a low whistle barely audible. A signal dot from behind the barn, Valor trotted into place. From the creekside, Flint emerged. Circling wide to flank Dot, the riders came into view. Doc Jace, Buck, and Lonnie. No Clay, that was strange. They slowed their horses as they approached, expressions hard and postures tense. Jace had a rifle laid across his lap. Buck was chewing something, but the motion looked forced, angry. Lonnie kept glancing around, eyes twitchy. Zeke didn't speak. Jace called out first. "Nice place you got, Boone. Little scorched, but hell, plenty of room for graves." Zeke remained still. Buck grinned. "Thought you'd have cleared out by now, or maybe you were waiting for us." Still no reply. Jace squinted. "You hear us, old man?" Zeke finally moved just a step forward. "I hear you," he said. "All three of you." Jace on the paint. Buck, always chewing. Lonnie's saddle squeaks. Lonnie flinched. "He's bluffing." "He can't." "He can," Jace snapped. "Shut up." Zeke raised a hand and gave a short whistle. Two sharp notes. Valor and Flint circled behind the riders like shadows cutting through morning fog. The Outlaws spun their horses around in panic. "Where the hell?" Buck shouted. The stallions didn't charge. They just circled. Tight. Controlled. Zeke took another step forward. "You boys came here expecting me to fight like you do. Loud, crude, stupid." Jace raised the rifle, but Widowmaker moved between them in a blink, snorting thunder, head down, hooves pawing the earth. "You're trespassing," Zeke said flatly. Buck spat into the dirt. "You gonna call the law? Ain't no sheriff this far out." "I don't need law," Zeke said. "I've got memory." The horses stopped circling. 3 stallions, 3 outlaws. Each one watched. Each one waited. Zeke's hand hovered near the whistle. Lonnie paled. "He's gonna do it again." "Back off," Jace growled. But Zeke didn't blow the whistle. He just held up 2 fingers. A signal. The horses pressed forward. Not fast, not violently, just close enough for the outlaws to feel the pressure. The understanding they weren't in control. Zeke's voice dropped. "Tell Clay the land's mine. Tell him I didn't come to start a war." Jace glared. "But you'll finish it, huh?" Zeke nodded once. "If I have to?" Buck looked around. "Let's go. This place ain't worth getting kicked by a demon horse." Jace didn't move until Widowmaker stepped forward and let out a single, sharp snort. Then he turned his horse around. The 3 outlaws retreated, fast and silent, dust trailing behind them as they disappeared back toward town. Zeke stood there for a long moment, listening to the hoofbeats fade. Then he lowered his hand. The horses relaxed. He turned toward the barn again, speaking softly as he walked. "Now they know." Widowmaker followed, head low. "Come again." This was Boone Hollow. And uninvited guests didn't get to leave with all their courage intact. Back in Willow Creek, the dust hadn't yet settled from the confrontation out at Boone Hollow, but the ripple effects were already shaking the town's fragile balance. Word traveled fast here, faster than horses and louder than gunshots. By sundown, nearly every saloon patron, shopkeeper, and ranch hand had heard it. Maddox's boys had ridden out to Boone Hollow to scare off the blind farmer and come riding back pale and shaken. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The bruises told enough of the story. Jace had a cut above his brow. Buck was limping. Lonnie didn't say a word, just kept staring out the window like a ghost had followed him home. And Sheriff Ada Langley. She knew exactly what that meant. She stood at her office window, staring out at the quiet street, arms crossed over her chest. A storm was coming, one not made of thunder and lightning, but of grudges, greed, and pride. Her deputy, Harold, leaned against the wall behind her, chewing nervously on a toothpick. So, he really did it. Ada didn't look back. He reclaimed Boone Hollow with horses. With discipline, she corrected. Harold whistled softly. "That ain't gonna sit well with Clay." "No," she said, "it won't." She turned from the window and moved to her desk, where an old file sat open-yellowed and brittle. Ezekiel Boone's name was scrawled at the top, along with a date from 2 years prior. She ran her fingers over the ink. "Back then, we didn't protect him," she said. "We didn't fight for his claim. We let the fire take it, and we let Maddox twist the story." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't have proof, Sheriff. We had our guts," she snapped. then sighed, softening, and we ignored them. Harold rubbed the back of his neck. So what now? We arrest Maddox? Ada shook her head. Not yet, not unless he crosses the line out loud. He will, I know. She walked back to the window, looking toward the horizon where Boone Hollow lay. It was quiet out there now, but quiet didn't mean safe. Clay Maddox had lost face. His men were humiliated. That kind of man doesn't retreat. He reloads. Ada had dealt with Maddox before. Backroom threats, intimidation, masked by charm. The way he manipulated the town with bribes and favors, keeping his boots clean while others did his dirty work. But Zeke had just changed that. With no army, no posse, just 3 horses and a whistle. He didn't challenge Maddox with violence. He challenged him with dignity, and dignity was far more dangerous in a place like Willow Creek. Harold watched her pace. You gonna ride out there? Check on Boone. Ada nodded. Tomorrow morning, you want backup. I want honesty, she said, grabbing her coat. And a town that remembers what justice actually looks like. Harold frowned. Really think he can hold the land? Ada paused at the door. He already has. The question is whether we'll let him keep it, or whether we let fear win again. She stepped out into the cooling night, hat low, badge gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Willow Creek was on the edge of something. The kind of moment towns are remembered for one way or the other. And at the heart of it stood a blind man with a past full of war, a land full of ghosts, and horses trained to obey a whisper. Sheriff Langley didn't know how it would end, but she knew one thing for sure. Ezekiel Boone wasn't the one who should be worried. Clay Maddox paced the back room of the saloon like a wolf with a thorn in its paw. The lantern on the table flickered, casting jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Bottles clinked each time he kicked the leg of the old chair, and his boots left scuffs on the dusty floorboards with every angry stride. Buck sat slumped in the corner, nursing his ribs with a grimace. You should have seen his face, he muttered, shaking his head. Didn't blink, not once. Like he knew we weren't going to do a damn thing. I was going to shoot, Jace growled. That damn horse nearly took my face off. You should have. Pulled the trigger, Clay snapped. I couldn't, Jace barked. That stallion's eyes were on me like it knew what I was thinking. Like it wanted me to draw first. Clay spun on him. It's just a horse. No, boss, Buck said slowly. It ain't. Clay stared at them both, breathing hard. He looked like a man who'd just been unseated, not by force, but by fear. Real fear. The kind that crept into your bones because you couldn't explain it, couldn't fight it. He slammed his fist into the wall, sending dust and plaster raining down. You all let a blind man and a few horses chase you off my land. Lonnie, still pale and silent, stood near the door. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Clay turned to him. You've got something to say? Lonnie swallowed. He wasn't bluffing. The way those horses moved, it was like they'd done it before, like he trained M for war. He did, Buck muttered. Clay narrowed his eyes. What? He was cavalry, remember? Buck said. Not just some farmer with a plow, fought in the 3rd Battalion, taught horses to charge, flank, surround. Hell, they used to say he could clear a trench with just a whistle. Clay snorted. That's soldier fairy tales. Maybe, Buck said, meeting his eyes. But I've never seen anything like what we saw out there. Clay paced again. The sheriff won't do a damn thing. That much I know. She's got a soft spot for old war heroes. If she was gonna stop me, she'd have done it years ago. Jace leaned forward. So, what's the play? Clay stopped pacing. His face darkened. Like thunder rolling over the plains, we take the land back. Buck blinked. You serious? Dead serious. We let this go. Every rancher from here to Dry Creek is gonna think I've gone soft. That a blind man outdanced me. I can't afford that. Jace leaned back, folding his arms. So what? You're gonna shoot him down in his own yard? Sheriff's? Not gonna look the other way twice. Clay's lips curled into a grin. But it wasn't joyful, it was cruel. Who said anything about shoot? Land like that don't need bullets to change hands. Just fire. Worked once before. The room fell dead quiet. Lonnie flinched. You mean ... burn it again? Clay's eyes glinted in the low light. Only this time, make sure he's in it. Buck said firmly, standing. I ain't signing on to murder. Theft, sure. Threats, maybe. But fire with a man inside? That's different. Then don't sign, Clay said coldly. I'll find someone who will. He looked at Jace, who hesitated, then nodded. "Get the kerosene," Clay ordered, "and a new pair of matches. Tonight, we erase Boone Hollow for good." No one spoke. They didn't have to. The lines had been drawn, and Clay Maddox had just crossed his dot outside. The wind picked up. It whistled through the alleys and over the rooftops, a sound like warning, but Clay, drunk on vengeance and shame, didn't hear it. He only heard the crackle of a fire that hadn't yet started, and the lie he kept telling himself that Boone Hollow was just land. Not a legacy, not a legend, not a trap waiting to be sprung, but it was. And by sunrise, he'd learn it the hard way. The stars were dim that night, smothered by thick clouds that rolled low and heavy over Willow Creek. No moonlight broke through, no coyotes howled. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath as if nature itself had gone still in anticipation. Of what was to come out at Boone Hollow, Zeke sat alone on the porch beam he had righted earlier that day. The cabin loomed behind him, dark but sturdy. He had cleaned the inside, reinforced the weak walls with salvaged lumber, patched the holes in the roof. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold Dot. It had to, because tonight he wasn't waiting for peace, he was waiting for fire. Widowmaker lay a few yards away beneath a tree, head resting on his front legs, breathing slow but alert. Valor and Flint roamed the tree line, their hoofbeats muffled by earth and training. They moved like sentinels, like shadows. Zeke lifted the brass whistle from his chest and held it between his fingers. It wasn't fear that, curled in his gut, it was resolve. He didn't need to see the flames to know they were coming. He knew Clay Maddox, knew his type, and knew exactly how far men like him would go when pride was wounded back in the war. Zeke had once been trapped behind enemy lines for 3 days with no food, no map, no light. Only his horses and his instincts had brought him home. Since then, he trusted both more than he trusted people. He stood and walked to the far end of the property. Stopping near a pile of scrap wood he'd stacked earlier that day, he reached under it and pulled out a small, iron-banded crate. Inside, flares, smoke bombs, flash powder, military issue old, but reliable. Buried years ago, back when Boone Hollow was still a safe place, they'd been left for a rainy day. And tonight, it was pouring darkness. Zeke worked quickly, placing the tools in select spots. Near the barn, along the trail, at the fence line, where the grass grew thick and dry. He wasn't planning to kill, but he was planning to. End something, he returned to the porch, just as Widowmaker lifted his head, ears turning sharply toward the west. Zeke listened. Nothing at first, then a faint creak, leather saddle, metal dot riders, 3 of them moving slow, trying to be quiet. Just like before, Zeke murmured. He stepped into the cabin and struck a match, lighting the small lantern on the floor. The flame glowed softly through, the cracks in the walls just enough to paint a silhouette. A figure inside, waiting, vulnerable. It was bait. He left the door half open and walked around the back, melting into the trees with the practiced silence of a ghost. Widowmaker followed at his side without a command. They crouched low behind the old corral and waited. It didn't take long. Jace appeared first, crouched low, his boots silent in the dry grass. He carried a sloshing canister in one hand. A trail of liquid followed in his wake. Kerosene. Lonnie came next, glancing nervously over his shoulder. He held matches in a trembling grip. Then Clay emerged, face hard and empty. No hesitation, no remorse, just business. "Start with the barn," Clay whispered, "then the house. Make sure no one gets out." Zeke's grip tightened around the whistle. But he didn't blow it yet. He waited. Jace poured the fuel. Lonnie dropped to one knee near the porch, preparing the first strike. And that's when Zeke moved. One sharp whistle, 3 quick bursts from the tree line. Valor charged. From the creek, Flint followed, and from behind the corral, Widowmaker exploded forward like a cannonball. The riders barely had time to turn. Jace shouted and dropped the canister, spilling kerosene on his boots as he scrambled backward. Valor cut him off, hooves pounding, hurting him away from the house. Lonnie lit the match only to have it snuffed out by a sudden gust as Flint passed inches from his face. The boy screamed, fell backward, and dropped the entire matchbook into the mud. Clay spun around, gun half drawn, but Zeke was already there. He stepped out from the shadows, standing tall between the barn and the cabin, eyes clouded but unwavering. "Mistake," he said. "Was thinking you were the predator." Clay raised his gun. Zeke blew the second whistle. Flashed the flare behind the barn ignited, bathing the scene in blood-red light. The horses surged, bucked, trapped the men in a triangle of muscle, speed, and fury. Clay fired wildly once, TWICEA. Hoof struck his wrist, sending the revolver flying into the dark. He stumbled, blood dripping from his fingers, and stared up at Zeke. "You're blind," he spat. Zeke stepped forward. "And you're finished." He raised the final flare and threw it into the sky. It exploded like thunder, casting blue light over Boone Hollow, a warning dot to the town, to the law, to the law, to the legacy. Clay Maddox fell to his knees, not because he was beaten, but because he finally understood. This wasn't just land, this was sacred ground, guarded not by walls or men, but by trust, training, and one man who refused to let it burn again. Not tonight, not ever. By dawn, the sky was bruised with streaks of orange and purple. Smoke rose from the scorched patches of earth near the barn, not from fire, but from flares long spent. The scent of singed grass and hot metal lingered like an aftertaste. But Boone Hollow had not burned. Not this time. Clay Maddox lay face down in the dirt, his left arm cradled uselessly at his side, blood crusted around his wrist, shattered from the blow of a hoof. His revolver was buried somewhere in the mud, useless. He wasn't dead, but close enough to remember the difference. Lonnie sat trembling under the broken fence, cradling scraped knees and staring at the horizon like he'd seen the end of the world. Jace was nowhere in sight. He'd bolted into the woods when the flares burst overhead. Whether he was headed back to Willow Creek or just running for his life, Zeke didn't care. Widowmaker stood tall beside him, steam rising off his flanks, hooves dark with dust, not panting, not afraid. Just watching. The other horses had fallen back to their posts, circling the perimeter at a lazy trot now, as if their job was done. Zeke knelt beside Clay without speaking. He didn't need to dot. Clay looked up at him, his lips split and eyes glassy with rage and disbelief. You, ... You think this makes you a hero?" "No," Zeke said, voice calm. "It makes me homeowner." Clay let out a weak, broken laugh. "You think they'll keep backing you? The sheriff? The town? You think this hollow means anything to them?" Zeke shook his head. "It means something. To me, that's enough." Clay tried to sit up, but a sharp grunt escaped him as his arm refused to move. "You don't get to win. I own this town." "You owned their silence," Zeke replied. "Not anymore." He stood slowly, the dawn light catching the brass whistle at his neck. For a moment, he looked like a figure from another time ghostly, immovable, forged from iron and fire. Then came the sound of riders. 2, maybe 3, galloping hard from the North Ridge. Sheriff Ada Langley arrived first, reins tight, hat pulled low. Behind her came Harold and another deputy, both armed but with weapons holstered. Ada took one look at the scene and slid down from her saddle. She walked past Clay without acknowledgement and came to stand beside Zeke. "You all right?" she asked. Zeke nodded. "It's over." "Looks like hell tried to move in," Harold muttered as he surveyed the scorched grass and scattered gear. "Hell got evicted," Ada said. She turned to Clay, who groaned again as Harold and the deputy dragged him to his feet. "You're under arrest," she said simply. "For what?" Clay spat. "You got no proof." "Arson attempt," she replied. "Trespassing, intent to harm, assault with a deadly weapon. None of that's provable." "I don't need to prove it," she said, eyes sharp, "because you know it, and so do the people. You've been playing big dog in this town for too long, Maddox, but the leash snapped tonight." Clay locked eyes with her. "You're protecting him." "I'm protecting what's right," she replied. "You burned his life down once, you won't do it again." She turned to Zeke. "You pressing charges?" He looked down at Clay, thought for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "Let him live with the shame." Clay flinched at that more than he had when his wrist shattered. As they hauled him away, Lonnie stumbled to his feet and staggered after them, eyes still wide and unfocused. Ada stayed a moment longer. "Town's gonna wake up soon. They'll be looking for answers." Zeke gave a soft whistle. Widowmaker trotted up and nuzzled his shoulder. "They'll find them here," Zeke said. same as always. Ada smiled faintly. They used to say, "Legends don't come back." "I never left," he replied. She mounted her horse and gave him a nod. "See you around, Boone." Zeke stood alone again as they rode off, but it didn't feel like solitude. It felt like victory. The wind picked up, blowing through the hollow, stirring ash and dust into the air. The land was scarred, tired but standing, just like him. He walked back to the porch and sat down, letting the morning sun warm his face. Widowmaker lay beside him, head resting near Zeke's boot. Boone Hollow was safe. For now, and in a town where memories faded fast, this morning would last in whispers, in warnings, in stories of the blind farmer who didn't need sight to see everything clearly. Willow Creek awoke to a sunrise painted in fire-kissed gold, but the real heat of the day came not from the sun, it came from the stories. By noon, the saloon was packed wall to wall. The usual dusty gossip had been replaced by wide-eyed accounts, each more dramatic than the last. "I swear on my mama's grave," barked one rancher. "That horse kicked the gun clean out of Maddox's hand like it knew where he was aiming." "3 horses," corrected another. "Trained like soldiers, moved in formation like a pack of wolves." Surrounding M, heard in M, it was like Watt in a war butt. The general wasn't even holding a rifle. I heard he never said a word, just whistled, and they knew it was biblical. At the general store, Miss Granger told anyone who'd listen how Lonnie Wilkes came stumbling into town near dawn. Muddy from head to toe, eyes wide like he'd seen the devil in the trees. He didn't say a word, just kept repeating. They weren't horses. They were shadows with hooves. By the time the church bell rang for midday, half the town had already changed their minds about the blind farmer who'd once been pitied, mocked, or forgotten. No one was laughing anymore. Behind the scenes, Sheriff Ada Langley was putting pen to paper, filing formal charges against Clay Maddox for attempted arson and conspiracy to commit murder. For once, the mayor wasn't blocking her. He'd been uncharacteristically quiet all morning. The word was, Maddox had threatened him. And the man figured out too late that the only person standing between him and complete ruin had just been led away in cuffs in her office. Ada read over the reports from her deputy's statements from witnesses, sworn affidavits from townsfolk who'd seen Maddox's men ride out of town with fire in their eyes and come back looking like whipped dogs. Still, it wasn't the paperwork that mattered most, it was the shift. The slow, heavy shift in how people looked at Boone Hollow. For years, it had been cursed ground, the site of an old tragedy, burnt land, haunted stories, and one blind man who had vanished into the hills. Now it was something else entirely, a statement. Out on the edge of town, at the livery stables, young Caleb stood, brushing down one of the deputy's horses. He paused when a man approached a tall traveler with a weathered coat and a rifle slung over one shoulder. "Hey," the man said, "is it true?" "About the horses, the blind man." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He just kept brushing, calm and deliberate. "It's true, all of it," the traveler nodded, half in disbelief. "That fella still out there?" Caleb finally turned and looked at him. "He ain't going anywhere." The man tipped his hat. "Reckon I'll stay in town a while. Wouldn't mind." Learning from someone like that, he wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, more would arrive: horsemen, wanderers, even a few veterans who had heard whispers of a man named Boone who once trained cavalry mounts to dance between bullets. They came not for the land, but for the legend, and for the first time since the fire. Boone Hollow wasn't empty, it was alive. Zeke, of course, didn't say much. He still spent his days fixing fences, tending to the land, and listening to the land, and listening to the world the way only he could. Caleb brought him supplies. Ada visited every few days. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they sat one afternoon. As they watched the sun dip behind the ridge, Caleb asked, "You think Clay'll come back?" Zeke paused, then shook his head. He already did, and left with less than he brought. "So, it's over." Zeke gave a small, knowing smile. It's begun. And it had, because Boone Hollow wasn't just reclaimed land anymore. It was the center of a quiet revolution, a place where the forgotten could become fierce, where one man, without sight, without allies, without fear, had changed the town without firing a single bullet, just a whistle and a warning. The brass whistle around Ezekiel Boone's neck had never shone so brightly. Not because it had been polished, it hadn't. Dust still clung to the ridges, and age still dulled the edge butt somehow. It gleamed all the same, like a badge earned, in silence, like a symbol not of war, but of what comes after. And the town had noticed on Willow Creek, folks began to wear small tokens of their own, strips of leather tied around their wrists, bits of copper carved into horse shapes, even whistles, fashioned from tin and worn like pendants, not to use, but to honor. It wasn't about Zeke alone. It was about what he represented. Strength without violence, honor without spectacle, and vision without sight. Zeke himself didn't change much. He still rose before the sun, still walked the perimeter of Boone Hollow with Widowmaker and the others. At his side, still tended the land with quiet purpose. But the visitors came more often now, veterans mostly. A few had fought under different banners in different places, but they recognized him not by his face, but by his posture, by the way. The horses responded to a subtle shift of breath or the softest hum. They came for knowledge, for healing. Zeke didn't offer lectures. He offered space. Time and a rhythm that healed without needing words. One afternoon, a young woman arrived, a rider named Alina from the southern valleys. Her horse had been injured in a skirmish with rustlers. She came looking for a cure, not just for her mount, but for herself. Zeke let her stay, said little, and let Widowmaker show her the trail routes, while Flint shadowed her injured mare on 2 weeks. Her horse was running again. In 3, she was smiling again. Before she left, she touched the whistle hanging around Zeke's neck. "It's not just for the horses, is it?" she asked. Zeke shook his head. "Never was." She left a small charm on the fence post, an iron key, tied with red string, for when doors need opening, she said. By fall, a small camp had formed at the edge of Boone Hollow. It wasn't formal, no signs, no rules. Just people who needed something and believed they might find it here. Ada dropped by more often, bringing supplies, sometimes staying overnight by the fire pit that Zeke had built from the stones his father once used to mark the old property line. They rarely spoke about the past. They didn't need to. The present was loud enough. Back in town, Clay Maddox was gone, hauled off under armed escort to face judgment elsewhere. His name faded faster than expected, placed in conversation by things that mattered. Crops, horses, kindness. Even the mayor made an unannounced visit to Boone Hollow, stumbling through a nervous apology and offering a donation of fencing wood. Zeke accepted the lumber, not the words, but the message was clear. The town had turned. One night, as the fire crackled near the cabin and Widowmaker dozed with one eye open, Caleb sat across from Zeke, knees pulled to his chest. "You know," the boy said, "some folks think that whistle is magic." Zeke smiled, faint and worn. "It's just brass." Caleb looked at him, serious now. "No, I mean it. They think it's more than a signal, that it's a calling, like it brings out what people forgot they had." Zeke was quiet a long time. Then he said, "It does, but not because of the sound." "Then what?" "Because of the silence that follows." And that was the truth of it. The whistle was only half the message. The rest was in what came after. The stillness, the discipline, the trust. And in Boone Hollow, people were learning that again, not from sermons, not from force, but from a blind man who listened better than most men ever saw. And in the quiet echo of his whistle, legacies began to bloom again. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse whinnied softly. Somewhere in the town, a child practiced walking, heeled Huto in the dirt, imagining themselves strong enough to ride without reins. And somewhere, deep inside the land that refused to burn, the future waited. Not loudly, but faithfully. The first frost came early that year. It glittered across the fields of Boone Hollow like powdered glass, clinging to every blade of grass and rail of wood. The creek sang quieter in the cold, and the morning mist rose heavy, blanketing the land. In a silver hush, Zeke Boone stood at the center of it all, one hand resting gently on Widowmaker's flank. The stallion stood still as stone, but his ears twitched with every sound, a hawk overhead. The breath of the wind, the rustle of someone approaching along the path. Caleb emerged, scarf crooked around his neck and cheeks red from the chill, carried 2 pails of water and a question in his eyes. "Did you sleep last night?" the boy asked. Zeke didn't answer right away. He tilted his head as if listening not just to the world, but to something beneath it. Horses were restless, he finally said. Caleb frowned. Coyotes? No, Zeke murmured. Dreams. The boy blinked. Horses have dreams. Zeke knelt beside Widowmaker and began brushing the frost from his coat. Every creature does, but not all remember horses. They remember in motion. Caleb crouched beside him. What do they dream about? Zeke paused, his hands never stopping. Freedom, fear, sometimes fire. The boy looked away. Everyone still whispered about the fire. The one that took Zeke's land. The one that tried to take it again, but the ashes were long buried now. What remained was stronger. That morning, Zeke walked the ridge with all 3 horses at his side. Widowmaker to his right, Flint and Valor behind. The frost crunched beneath their steps. No saddle, no rope, just trust. Along the path, a new signpost had been driven into the earth by visitors from town. Boone Hollow Sanctuary. Zeke hadn't asked for the name, but he hadn't removed the post. Either sanctuary, it was a word with weight. Not just safety, but restoration. A place where something broken might begin again. And Boone Hollow was beginning again. Each week brought new travelers, not many but enough. Some stayed, some passed through. A widow and her daughter had taken to planting herbs on the far slope. A young man built a shelter at the edge of the ridge and carved wooden saddles for children. Elena returned with her now-recovered mare, this time as a teacher. Not a student, but it was the horses that told the real story. They roamed freer now, but stayed close. No fences needed. No reins. Zeke didn't command them. They listened because they trusted, and in return, he trusted them back. He trained a new foal born from Valor, teaching him the same signals the others knew. Low whistles, shifts in breath, stillness. Caleb watched each lesson like scripture. Will they always obey you? The boy asked one evening as they sat by the fire. No, Zeke said. They obey the truth. I just happen to carry it, right? Now, he leaned back, staring upward with blind eyes that still somehow saw deeper than most. They'll follow someone else when it's time. Me? Caleb asked. Surprised. Zeke said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, maybe. A long silence passed between them. Soft, warm, comfortable. Then Zeke added, if you learn to listen more than you speak, and if you remember one thing, what's that what you teach a horse isn't how to fear you, but how to trust you. The fire crackled. Somewhere, Widowmaker let out a soft snort in his sleep, and in the stillness, a new kind of dream began, one that didn't belong to Zeke alone. It belonged to the land, to the boy, to the future, and to the horses, who remembered. It was dusk when the stranger arrived. The shadows stretched long across Boone Hollow, bleeding from the trees like ink into paper. Zeke was out in the field with Caleb, teaching the young foal to follow vocal cues. Each sound was soft, barely audible above the wind. But the colt responded like it had been born for it. Then, Widowmaker lifted his head sharply. His ears flicked toward the trail. Zeke stilled, even blind. He sensed the change in the air, subtle but distinct. A new rhythm, a new presence. The horses, without cue, began to shift positions, Widowmaker moving to Zeke's right, Valor pacing toward the ridgeline, Flint settling calmly near Caleb as if to keep the boy safe. Then came the sound of hooves. On packed earth, one rider, unhurried, uninvited, unannounced, the man crested the hill slowly, the dying light behind him obscuring his face. He wore a long coat that fluttered with the wind and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. His horse was lean and black, with the gait of an animal that had traveled far but wasn't weary yet. He stopped 20 feet from Zeke, said nothing, just watched. Zeke didn't flinch. He kept one hand on Widowmaker's mane and tilted his head slightly. You lost, he asked, his voice calm. No, the stranger answered after a long pause. I'm exactly where I meant to be. Caleb stood behind Zeke now, heart thudding. You know him? He whispered. No, Zeke replied. But I know the way he sits a horse. The stranger dismounted, slow and deliberate, as if every motion had been practiced. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't make a threat. Instead, he walked forward and removed his hat, revealing a scar across his temple and eyes sharp enough to cut stone. I heard stories, the man said, about a blind man with warhorses. Thought I'd see it myself. Zeke offered no smile, no greeting, and now that you have got questions, Zeke nodded, then asked them. The man looked past Zeke toward the cabin, the horses, the field. His jaw worked like he was chewing over something hard. "Is it true?" he said slowly. "You beat Clay Maddox without firing a single shot." "It's true," Zeke said, "using nothing but horses." Zeke's hand moved to the whistle around his neck. Not just horses, trust, training, patience. The man folded his arms. "You think that's enough to hold land in times like these?" Zeke stepped forward one pace. "It was enough to reclaim it, and it'll be enough to keep it." The stranger nodded slowly. "I used to train horses." During the war, Zeke's chin tilted upward. "I know," that caught the man off guard. "You do. I can hear it in the way they breathe around you," Zeke said. "Your horse respects you, but he's waiting for you to respect yourself again." The man looked away, ashamed. "I haven't ridden for purpose in a long time." Zeke extended a hand not to shake, but to point. "To stay here, you don't need purpose, just honesty. You willing to learn again?" The stranger stared at the hand for a long moment, then nodded. Zeke lowered it. "Then tomorrow, you start mucking the stalls." Caleb blinked. "What? That's it?" Zeke smiled faintly. "It's how I started." The man let out a dry chuckle and looked around the hollow at the horses. "Soil. I thought this place was myth." Zeke turned back toward the cabin. "It still is. We're just writing the next chapter." And as the stranger followed him into the hollow, dusk finally gave way to night dot. The wind whispered through the trees, the horses exhaled in unison, and the whistle at Zeke's chest, though silent now, still sang the quiet song of welcome. For those who remembered what it meant to earn trust, to protect the land, and to ride not for war but for something better. It was well past midnight when the wind changed, not the gentle breeze that passed through the hollow most nights, rustling the leaves and tugging softly at the fence posts. No, this wind was colder, sharper, and carried something else with it, a memory, a presence. Zeke stirred from his sleep before the sound even reached the cabin walls. He sat up on his cot, eyes open though sightless, listening, a low, distant creak, not wood, not rope, dot saddle leather dot, then a series of soft hoofbeats, faint, like an echo, drifting from the far ridgeline. Not one horse, several, and not alive. He rose and walked to the porch, bare feet brushing the old wood. Widowmaker stood already, ears forward, alert but not alarmed. Flint emerged from the shadows beneath the pines, his breath visible in the cold air. Valor trotted to the crest of the knoll and stopped, looking toward the east. There, under the silver wash of starlight, came the ghosts. 3 horses, no riders. They moved in unison, slow, deliberate, heavy with memory. Their hooves made no sound. On the earth, their eyes shimmered faintly with the light of a world long past. Zeke didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew them, old friends' mounts he'd trained during the war, horses who had fallen on the battlefield, some beside him, others far away. They weren't real, not in the flesh, but they were here, riding the boundary of Boone Hollow, as if answering some eternal muster call. Behind him, the door creaked open. Caleb stepped out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Zeke raised a hand, quieting the boy. Caleb followed. His gaze, and though he saw nothing at first, the hairs on his neck stood on end. Then he saw them, 3 silhouettes, their manes flowing in slow motion, their movements as graceful as fog across water. "What are they?" Caleb whispered. Zeke didn't answer directly. He whispered back, proof of what? That some loyalty never dies. The ghost horses moved to the edge of the clearing, circled once, and stood perfectly still. Widowmaker took a step forward, then stopped, nostrils flaring. Flint dipped his head in silent recognition. Valor stayed close to Zeke's side, calm but reverent. The air was still. Zeke stepped off the porch, barefoot in the frost. He walked to the center of the field and lifted his hand, slowly, not to command, to salute. The ghost horses bowed their heads. As one dot then, without a sound, they turned and galloped toward the horizon, fading with each stride until only the night remained. Zeke stood in place long after they vanished. Beside him, Caleb trembled not in fear, but in awe. They were yours, weren't they? he asked softly. Zeke nodded, and now they're everyone's. What do you mean? I mean, Zeke said, turning back to the boy. When you give yourself fully to something land loyalty, life it remembers. Even after death, Boone Hollow remembers. They sat together on the porch after that, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. The wind returned to its usual rhythm, brushing gently through the trees. But Caleb never forgot what he'd seen. That night proved something stories could only suggest. The hollow wasn't just sacred because of what stood on it was sacred because of what had once ridden through it. And what still did. When the night was quiet enough for the past to come home, Zeke didn't speak of the ghosts again. He didn't need to. But from that night forward, he left 3 apples at the edge of the clearing every morning, and every morning they were gone. Spring came to Boone Hollow not with a shout, but with a breath. The snow melted in silence. The creek, once hushed by ice, sang again. Buds broke through brittle branches, and green returned to the hills like a memory remembered just in time. Zeke. Boone stood barefoot in the garden, tilling the earth by hand. Not because he had to. Caleb would have done it gladly, but because this was how he listened. Fingertips pressed into soil, palms reading the lines of the land. Every clump of dirt told a story. What had been planted here before, what still grew underneath. What roots had given up, and which ones refused to die. Boone Hollow was full of roots that refused to die. Caleb sat nearby with Alina, sketching a new layout for the corral gates. The young mare Alina brought months ago now ran confidently with the herd, healed and strong. The girl herself had changed too, no longer walking like someone running from something, but toward something. Zeke, Alina called, brushing back a loose braid. What do you think about putting the new gate by the western trail? Zeke didn't turn. He simply pressed his hand into the earth and said, not there. The roots are tangled under that slope. They'll shift when it rains. Caleb grinned. He doesn't even have to look. It's like the ground talks to him. Zeke stood, brushing dirt from his hands. It does. Just takes most people a few years to learn the language. From behind them came the distant sound of hooves, not hurried, not heavy, just steady. Ada rode into the clearing. Tipping her hat as she dismounted, she carried with her a small satchel and a paper, folded tight. Zeke met her at the fence line. You've got that look, he said. What look's that? She asked. The one you? When you've got bad news wrapped in bureaucracy. Ada chuckled, still a sharper eye than most. She handed him the paper. Surveyors from the county. They want to reroute the new rail spur right through Boone Hollow. Zeke held the paper, though he didn't read it. His jaw tensed slightly. When not for months, maybe longer, but the plan's drawn. And someone in a polished office thinks this valley's just empty space on a map. Caleb and Alina looked up from their drawing, alarmed. But they can't, Caleb said. This land's protected now, right? Ada shook her head. Not officially. Not the way cities and counties see protection. There's no deed marked sacred, no stamp for history that lives in hoofprints and whispers. Zeke turned the paper over in his hands. He wasn't angry. Not yet he was. Still then, quietly, he said, then we remind them it's not empty. That night, the plan began. Zeke didn't want protest signs or shouting in town hall. He wanted the land itself to speak, and it did. The next morning, people from Willow Creek came out by the dozens, not to build but to witness. They walked the trails, touched the stones, sat beside the horses and listened. And for the first time, they heard it what? Zeke had always heard the language of the earth, the breath of trees, the silent heartbeat of land that had survived fire, greed, and fear and still chose to grow. A week later, Ada sent a letter back to the county office. She included signatures. Over 200 of them, she included stories, handwritten accounts of what Boone Hollow had become, a sanctuary, a school, a place of peace. And at the very bottom of the letter, tucked into the envelope, was a single brass whistle. No words, just the weight of it, it was enough. The surveyors never came. The rail spur found a new path, and Boone Hollow remained untouched, not because it was louder than the rest of the world, but because it was quieter, deeper, unshakable. And on a spring morning, with his hands in the earth and the sky soft above him, Zeke Boone smiled. The land had listened, and for once, the world had. The days in Boone Hollow began earlier now, not out of necessity, but rhythm-like, the land and its keepers were waking in perfect time with one another. Birds called out from the trees before sunrise, and the horses, once slow to rise in colder months, now moved with ease through the fog-laced pastures. It was the season of motion, of learning, and Zeke Boone was teaching without ever raising his voice. The sanctuary had grown not in size, but in purpose. The visitors who once came to gawk or pass through now stayed longer. Some left quietly, changed, others asked to remain, offering their hands, tools, or stories in exchange for something they hadn't found anywhere else. Stillness that healed, silence that taught. This morning, Zeke stood at the edge of the training ring with Caleb, and Alina beside them was Jacob, former ranch hand from another valley. His boots worn to the heel and his pride more broken than his body. He had scars down one arm and walked with a limp. War, accident. Zeke hadn't asked. It didn't matter. The man held a rope in one hand and stood frozen before Valor, the sleek mare who had once bucked at shadows. "She doesn't trust me," Jacob muttered. "She doesn't need to," Zeke replied. "You need to trust you first," Jacob exhaled. "I'm not a horseman. You don't have to be. What am I supposed to do then? Stand still?" Jacob blinked. "That's it for now." Zeke stepped back, said nothing more. Caleb watched from the fence, eyebrows raised. "That's the lesson," Alina smiled faintly. "It's always the lesson." They waited. Jacob stood quietly, uncertain but willing. Valor lowered her head slightly, ears flicked. Forward. She didn't move closer, but she didn't retreat either. Progress. After 15 minutes, Zeke gave one soft whistle. Valor stepped away. Jacob looked over, confused. Was that failure? Zeke shook his head. No. That was a question answered. "Tomorrow, you'll ask again." And he left it at that. The next day, Jacob returned. So did Valor. This time, she took a single step forward, and so it went. That same week, Caleb began leading lessons of his own, nothing formal, just teaching children from town how to hold the reins, how to balance in the saddle, how to breathe with the horse instead of against it. They didn't realize they were learning more than riding. They were learning patience, confidence, listening. Do you ever think Caleb asked Zeke one evening that maybe this is what you were meant to do? Not fight, not reclaim, just teach. Zeke paused as he tightened a saddle strap. "I don't believe in meant to. I believe in ready for." "You mean like the land?" "Yes," Zeke said. "You care for it, and eventually, it tells you what it's ready to grow." Caleb nodded slowly. "So, what's Boone Hollow ready for now?" Zeke smiled faintly. Voices other than mine. He wasn't being poetic. He meant it. He had trained the land, nurtured it back from ruin, defended it from flame and greed. And now, the hollow didn't belong to him, it belonged to everyone who had come to learn and give that evening. The fire circle was full. Alina played a soft tune on her harmonica. Jacob sat beside Valor, brushing her coat with quiet joy. Ada visited with a jar of honey, leaving it on the porch with a knowing smile. Zeke didn't speak much that night. He didn't need to, because now, the hollow itself had a voice. A voice found not in speeches or sermons, but in the gentle language of hands brushing horses, of boots pressed into good soil, of people learning, healing, and remembering that strength isn't loud, it's steady dot, and sometimes the best lessons are taught without a single word. The canyon behind Boone Hollow had always been a quiet place, not quite wilderness, not quite farmland, just stone, shadow, and time. It was a place where the wind whispered longer, and where sounds from the hollow would occasionally drift and bounce back as if the land was thinking aloud. Zeke had spent countless mornings walking the canyon's edge, letting the silence fill in spaces where memories stirred. It was where he went when he didn't have answers, only questions. And today, he had more questions than usual. Caleb followed him, boots scuffing gently against the stone path. "You never take anyone back here, because most people don't." "Listen," Zeke said, without turning. "I listen, I know." They walked for a while in silence, the canyon narrowing until the walls on either side rose like weathered cathedral columns. The path was smooth, time-worn by rains and winds, but never unkind. Zeke stopped suddenly. "What do you hear?" he asked. Caleb tilted his head. "Wind, maybe birds. Close your eyes." The boy obeyed. Now the sounds came clearer: shifts in air pressure, the flap of distant wings, the muffled rustle of brush as a rabbit scurried through. And something else, something deeper, a low hum, not mechanical or musical. Natural, resonant, the earth, Caleb whispered. Zeke nodded, the bones of the canyon, echoing back what we bring in. Caleb opened his eyes. Why bring me here? Zeke took a long breath. Because it's time you understand the last piece. Caleb waited. Zeke knelt, touched the ground. This place, it remembers pain. The fire spread through here before it reached the hollow, scorched the underbrush, killed 3 deer, 2 wild horses. I buried them myself. Caleb's expression changed, quiet reverence overtaking the curiosity. I didn't know. No. One does. I never told them. They see the land healed and assume it was always strong, but it broke first, and I did too. Zeke stood and took the whistle from his neck. This was never about control, he said. Not about commanding horses, or people, or the land. He placed the whistle in Caleb's hand. It's about respect for what's been lost, for what we carry, and for what we still stand to lose if we don't protect it. Caleb's fingers, closed around the cool brass, is this. Mine. Zeke gave a small nod. Not because you're ready, but because you want to be. A sudden gust swept through the canyon then, louder than before. Caleb turned, alarmed, but Zeke stood calm. Do you feel that? Zeke asked. It's like the canyon spoke back. It did. They stayed there a while longer. Just listening to the sound of the world remembering itself that night, back at the hollow, Caleb didn't wear the whistle around his neck. He placed it on the porch rail beside Zeke's chair. I'll earn it, he said quietly, not by asking, but by listening. Zeke nodded once. That was all the approval needed. The next morning, without prompting, Caleb rose early. He fed the horses, checked the fence line, helped Jacob repair a broken wheel on the supply cart. He taught the younger kids how to approach the nervous foal. Without startling her, he didn't raise his voice once. By sundown, Alina found the whistle still on the porch, not taking it. She asked. Not yet, Caleb said, but when the canyon echoes back with my voice, ... then I'll know. The hollow was teaching him just like it had taught Zeke, not in hours or days, but in echoes. And in the canyon's quiet return, the boy's steps grew steadier, and the land listened. There were no announcements, no gatherings, no post-it notices on the town board. Just a feeling in the wind, and the kind of hush that comes before a storm, not of weather, but of meaning. It began with Zeke saddling Widowmaker at dawn. Word spoken, no one asked where he was going. They didn't need to. Caleb stood at the gate, watching as the black stallion stepped out onto the trail, muscles smooth beneath dark hide, mane catching the morning light like ink soaked in gold. Zeke sat tall in the saddle, coat fluttering just slightly in the wind, the brass whistle still absent from his neck. For the first time in months, he was unarmed. No rifle slung across his back, no knife at his belt, just the quiet. The ride wasn't fast. It wasn't a charge. It was slower, reverent, almost like a procession, except no one had died, at least, not yet. He rode south, past the marker where Boone Hollow's edge met open grazing land. Then across the old logging trail where Clay Maddox once planned his ambush. The trees were taller now, recovered, watching by the time Zeke reached the canyon's lip. The sun had climbed high enough to cast shadows sharp against the rock. He dismounted there, tying Widowmaker gently to a low branch, and walked out to the overlooked dot below. The valley stretched like a painting not yet finished. He stood in silence. Then slowly, he removed his boots. The ground was cold beneath his feet, but he welcomed it. Let it remind him where he came from. He crouched and pressed one palm into the dirt. No ceremony, just contact. Behind him, hoofbeats, not urgent, but steady. He turned his head. Already knowing Caleb, the boy had followed from a distance in foot, just as Zeke once had in another life. He didn't speak, just approached, breathless and flushed, and stood beside him. Zeke didn't scold him, he nodded. Together, they looked out at the land. What is this place, really? Caleb asked. After a long pause, Zeke thought a while, then said, It's where you go when words aren't enough. Caleb nodded slowly. A grave. Zeke shook his head. No, a promise. He stood, brushing soil from his hand. You'll need to make this ride someday? I know. Alone, I know. They stood in silence again. Then Caleb reached into his coat pocket. The whistle, he held it out. I think it's ready. He said. Zeke took it, not to wear but to feel the weight. Not yet, he said, handing it back. Caleb blinked. But I thought, it's not about carrying it, Zeke said. It's about deserving to give it away. Caleb looked down at the brass in his palm, a lesson wrapped in silence. When they returned to the hollow, people had gathered, but not to cheer, just to be there. Alina met their eyes with a question, and Zeke nodded slightly. All was well. The ride had not been about distance. It had been about stillness, the kind that reminds a man of what he protects, even when no one's watching. That night, around the fire, no one spoke of the ride. They didn't need to. They simply sat together watching. Sparks rise into the stars, and listening to the sound of a promise kept. It arrived in the early light, tied to the leg of a bird, too proud to be tamed and too smart to be wild. Alina spotted it first, its wings slicing through the pink sky before it landed on the fence post with practiced grace. She moved carefully, gently untying the parchment without alarming the creature. No stamp, no seal, just worn edges and a single name written across the back. Ezekiel Boone. She brought it to the porch, where Zeke sat with his boots off and his hands around a mug of warm root tea. He didn't need to read the name to know it was his. You gonna open it? She asked. Zeke ran his fingers across the creases in the paper. It felt familiar, too familiar, handmade, the way they used to fold messages in the field during the war, folded not for formality, but for function, for speed. He nodded once, then broke the edge and opened it. The handwriting was rough, but precise, like a man who didn't write often, but remembered how when it mattered. Zeke, if you're reading this, it means I kept my promise not to die before saying what needed to be said. We both know I wasn't the better man. You led with silence. I led with fire, and I burned everything I touched. But you were right about the land. You always were, and I'm sorry. This letter comes with a deed. Don't ask how I got it. Let's just say I finally traded something worth more than whiskey. And fear, the Southern Ridge, it's yours now. For real this time, not just in memory. Use it for good, for horses, for whatever peace looks like to you. Don't forget me, even if I don't deserve remembering. Zeke sat still for a long time. Alina read over his shoulder quietly, then backed away. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Clay Maddox, the outlaw, the tormentor. The man who once tried to erase Zeke's name from the land, offering it back, not with arrogance, but with humility. Caleb arrived a few minutes later, his eyes wide when Alina handed him the second parchment taw, stamped and notarized deed with Zeke Boone's name clearly printed at the top. The South Ridge? He asked, incredulous. That's the part no one could ever claim. Zeke gave a slow nod. It was never about who could claim it. It was about who would respect it. And you do. Zeke's fingers tightened slightly around the letter. Even when he didn't, Clay understood that I did. That matters. That afternoon, the people of Boone Hollow gathered on the Southern Ridge. No speeches, no ceremony. They simply walked the land with their hands outstretched, touching the bark of trees, running fingers through wild grass. Listening for something unspoken, Zeke stood at the ridge's edge, looking out over the new boundary. It wasn't more land he'd gained. It was more responsibility, more soil to protect, more space for peace. Later, he burned Clay's letter carefully, respectfully letting the smoke rise up to the clouds. But the deed he placed in the cabin, not hidden, not displayed, just resting in the drawer beside the whistle. That night, he spoke at the fire, brief words. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing not to carry someone else's weight any longer. No one responded aloud, but everyone understood, because sometimes the land forgives before people do, and in the rustle of trees on the Southern Ridge, it was clear. Ghosts, when they listen long enough, can leave gifts behind. And in Boone Hollow, even enemies can plant peace. The sun rose gold and wide over Boone Hollow, casting light that reached every blade of grass, every fence post, and every soul who had come to call the place home. It wasn't just a new morning yet, felt like a threshold, like the hollow had grown roots deep enough to reach not just into the past, but into something permanent. That morning, Zeke stood at the center of the open field, with Widowmaker by his side and a small gathering of townsfolk around him. They weren't there for a celebration, not exactly. It wasn't in Boone Hollow's nature to throw parades or light fireworks. But today marked something important, a name, not for the land that had always been Boone Hollow, not for the horses. They came and went with their own legacies, but for the movement, for what had taken shape there. Caleb stood beside Zeke, holding a carved wooden sign wrapped in cloth. His fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of meaning. Zeke turned to the crowd, his voice steady but low. "It started as reclamation," he said. "A man trying to get back what was his." He paused, letting the wind tug gently at his coat. "But the land doesn't belong to any one man. And peace isn't a destination, it's a discipline." He stepped back and nodded to Caleb. The boy pulled the cloth free. The sign read, "The Hollow Trust, Sanctuary." For horse in hand, soft murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some smiled, others blinked back tears they didn't expect. Alina stepped forward, brushing dust from the bottom of the signpost. "It's perfect," she whispered. Zeke turned slightly toward her. "We're not a ranch, not a school, not a retreat. What are we then?" she asked. He raised his chin, a place where strength learns to be gentle again. Jacob, standing with one arm slung in a brace, looked around at the horses grazing quietly. "Nearby, sanctuary's a good word, a heavy word," Zeke replied. "One will have to earn every day." They planted the sign just past the northern path, where the old Boone Hollow trail forked and led travelers either into the wide hills or back toward Willow Creek. It would greet every rider who arrived, every lost soul wandering with questions, every child looking for something better than what they'd known. The Hollow Trust, it wasn't just a name, it was a commitment to care for animals others had given up on. To teach people not how to tame horses, but how to understand them, to protect land, not through ownership, but stewardship. That afternoon, Caleb gathered the children and showed them how to brush valor with gentleness, how to speak in low tones, how to kneel instead of stand tall when meeting a nervous colt. Alina led a group through the ridge trail, showing where wild herbs had returned. Jacob told his story not of scars, but of healing. And Zeke walked the fence line, the whistle around his neck for the first time in days, not because he needed it, because it reminded him of how far they'd come. When dusk settled, and the final beams of sunlight filtered through the valley like fire through stained glass, Zeke sat beneath the porch awning, Widowmaker beside him. Caleb approached. "Did we do it?" the boy asked. Zeke looked out at the hollow, at the people, the peace, the promise made real. He nodded. "Double quotes, we started it," he said, "and for Boone Hollow, that was enough, because names fade over time, but trust earned, lived, and shared, that lasts." For weeks, the skies had been kind sunlight, draping Boone Hollow like a blessing. But nature never offers peace without reminding us what power it also holds. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment, the sky was pale blue. Horses shifted in the pastures, ears twitching, hooves stamping. The air alone told him everything. Get the foals under cover. This one's going to test us. Moved like they had trained for this, though they never had, not for a storm this size. Jacob barked orders from the ridge trail, guiding Alina and two of the younger boys as they ushered skittish mares into the lower stables. Caleb ran between paddocks, his coat flapping like a flag, untying the gate locks and whispering calming words to each horse he passed. Zeke stood in the clearing with Widowmaker, whispering a command that sent the stallion galloping toward the northern edge of the valley, an unspoken signal to the rest of the herd. By the time the first crack of thunder split the sky, every soul in Boone Hollow was in motion. Then the rain came. It fell hard and fast, not in drops, but in sheets. The kind of downpour that blinds you, that drowns trails, that turns soil into sludge, and tests the strength of every post and beam ever sunk into the earth. The wind howled through the trees like a voice angry with itself, and the hollow bent but did not break. Inside the barn, the children huddled with the younger horses, using their bodies to block drafts, her fingers raw from rope and grit. Caleb ran to the west gate to secure a post that had come loose, mud up to his knees. He slipped once, caught himself on the beam, and pushed the stake back down, with the strength of someone far older than his years. Zeke, drenched to the bone, stood in the center of it, all his coat plastered to his frame, face turned to the sky, not defiant, but accepting. He whispered the same phrase over and over. "You are not here to take, only to test," and the storm listened. Because sometime before midnight, but unbroken. Some fences were down, but the horses were all accounted for. Not a soul had been lost, not a beam collapsed. They spent the day in mud and sweat, repairing what had been strained, retying rope, resetting posts, sharing quiet glances of pride. At sundown, Zeke stood again in the clearing, the sun returning through the clouds in rays that looked almost holy. Caleb approached, hair still damp, hands calloused and bruised. "Why didn't we panic?" the boy asked. Zeke turned. Around a fire fueled by dry timber kept safe in the tool shed, the people of Boone Hollow sat in silence, not because they were tired. Powerful strength of people who trust each other and the land they now called home. The season shifted subtly. The trees whispered of summer approaching. The wind, once crisp with spring, now carried the dry edge of heat. Fields turned a shade darker with growth. The hollow flourished, but peace has a way of drawing attention, even from those who once turned away from it. Word had spread beyond Willow Creek, of a blind man with horses that moved like soldiers, of a place where broken things healed, of land not taken, but earned. And not everyone liked that one morning. As Zeke and Caleb repaired the ridge fence, 3 riders came up the north trail. They wore Union blues knot, bright and pressed like in wartime, but faded like the men had held on longer than they should have. At first glance, they looked official, but Zeke didn't need sight to know better. He could hear it in the way they dismounted, too casual for soldiers, too calculated to be wanderers. Ezekiel Boone, the tallest one, called. Zeke nodded without rising. "You've got a fine spread here," the man said, eyeing the horses in the pasture. "Heard you trained em yourself. Whistle trained, is that right?" Zeke said nothing. Another man stepped forward, younger, wearing a revolver to clean for someone who used it often. "Thing is," he continued, "we've got an offer. Folks back east pay handsomely for animals like that, especially ones that obey without reins." Caleb stiffened. "They're not for sale." The tall one chuckled. "Kid, everything's for sale." Zeke rose slowly, brushing dirt from his gloves. "Not everything. Come on, Boone," the man said. "Think of what you could do with the money. Build a proper ranch. Send that boy to school. You've got more horses than hands. Let us take a few, say 3, and you won't hear from us again." Zeke tilted his head. "And if I say no," the men exchanged a look, "then maybe your hollow gets less peaceful." Wasn't a threat, it was a promise, dressed in politeness. Zeke stepped forward, calm and steady. "You think you're the first men to ride in here thinking money or muscle makes you right." He took one more step. "You're not." The youngest rider reached for his belt. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Before the man's hand reached, his holster widowmaker appeared from the tree line like smoke given form. Flint followed, his hooves thunder across the ridge. The men staggered back. Zeke raised a second whistle tone. The horses didn't charge. They circled, deliberate, controlled. Eyes sharp, ears pinned, muscle taut. Predators without malice. Guardians. Without fear, the tall man raised his hands, jaw clenched. "All right, message received." "Good," Zeke said, "because there won't be a second one." They mounted fast and rode faster. When they disappeared over the ridge, Caleb turned to Zeke. "Why didn't they push harder?" "Because they saw something money can't buy," Zeke said. Caleb tilted his head. "What's that?" Zeke didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the land, at the repaired fences, at the grazing horses, at the people in the distance, still working like nothing had happened. Then he said, "Conviction." That night, around the fire, Caleb retold the story to the others. Alina nodded. "So it started again, huh?" Zeke shook his head. "No, it ended today." "Why?" "Because they saw that Boone Hollow doesn't stand because of me. It stands because we do." And that was the last time anyone tried to buy what could only be because some legacies aren't for sale, and some places are protected by more than fences. They're protected by people who remember what it cost to build them, and aren't afraid to answer the knock at the gate. Boone Hollow had never known the kind of ceremonies that took place in churches or courthouses. There were no stained glass windows or gavel strikes in the valley. No altar but the land. No hymn but the wind. But when Zeke announced a gathering for sunset, no one questioned it. They simply came. Word spread quick through Willow Creek and the outlying ranches. The blind farmer was calling folks together not in warning, not in defense, but in invitation. And in Boone Hollow, an invitation from Zeke Boone meant something by sundown. The field near the corral was full. Men and women who had helped rebuild after the storm. Children who had learned to ride, listen, and grow. Widows who had found purpose. Again, mucking stalls beside ex-outlaws, newcomers, with old wounds, and every one of them had touched the land in some way, and had been touched back. Zeke stood barefoot in the grass. No weapons, no whistle, no horse, just a man and the truth in his voice. "Tonight," he said, "we mark not an ending, but a belonging." Caleb stood beside him, holding a wooden bowl filled with water from the stream that fed Boone Hollow. Alina carried a pouch of soil taken from the southern ridge. Jacob stood nearby with a small journal, the first official logbook of the Hollow Trust, its pages still mostly blank. Zeke continued, "This land doesn't belong to me, and it never did. It belongs to those who work it, those who respect it, and those who protect one another on it." He knelt and pressed his hand into the dirt. Boone Hollow stood through war, fire, and storm, because the ground remembers more than grief. It remembers hands. He looked to Caleb. "Yours." The boy stepped forward, dipping his fingers into the water, then the soil. He pressed his hand to the logbook's first page, leaving a print that stained the paper dark brown. Zeke nodded. Alina stepped next, repeating the same dot, then Jacob, then Ada, who'd quietly walked up from the ridge without announcement. Her badge tucked in her pocket, her hands steady as she placed her print beside the others. One by one, every person present left their mark, not a signature, not a name, a hand, a pledge. By the end, the logbook held dozens of prints, some small, some calloused, some trembling with age, and each one was a thread in a new kind of covenant, not with law, not with ownership, but with purpose. When the last handprint dried, Zeke closed the book and placed it in a wooden box beside the porch. He didn't lock it, didn't seal it, just left it there for any future soul to add to. The sun dipped low. Frogs began to sing near the creek, and for the first time in memory, Boone Hollow wasn't a place one man reclaimed. It was a place everyone had claimed. Together, they sat by the fire late into the night, not to celebrate, but to witness, as stars lit the sky above them. The people of Boone Hollow watched the flames dance and knew, without a word spoken, that they were now something more than visitors. They were stewards, heirs, guardians of a quiet strength and the valley. Listening in the hush between embers and ash, accepted their hands and called them its own. Morning came quiet and bright, no fanfare, no dramatic wind, just the sun cresting gently over Boone Hollow, as if even the sky understood that today was sacred. Zeke Boone sat on the porch in his usual chair, Widowmaker grazing not far off, his ears flicking lazily at the insects. A faint breeze stirred the grass, and the dew on the fence posts shimmered like silver dust around his neck. The brass whistle hung loose, untouched, unused. It had not sounded in weeks, not because it had lost its power, but because it was no longer needed. Across the hollow, people moved with quiet purpose. Alina checked saddle straps on a new foal's mother, humming a tune passed down from her grandmother. Caleb was teaching a young pair of siblings how to approach a nervous colt voice, low body, relaxed, as Zeke had once taught him. The journal sat on the porch rail beside the door, now nearly full of handprints and notes lessons, names, births of horses, and letters from townsfolk who came, healed, and returned home lighter than they arrived. Zeke traced the whistle with time in fire. 2. Save what he could. The third time at the auction. 2. Remind them who he was. Each note had echoed, not just through the air, but through time, through silence, through memory. But now the hollow breathed on its own. A hawk cried out high above, and Zeke lifted his face toward the sound. He couldn't see it, but he knew it. He could feel its shadow pass over the field like a blessing. Zeke, he turned slightly. Caleb! Thought it might belong to you. You're the future of this place. Might as well know what it took to earn it. Caleb nodded, the weight of it settling in. He didn't speak, just turned and walked back toward the stables. The cloth in his hands, Zeke leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The wind shifted. From down the ridge came the sound of hooves, many of them. Not a stampede. A return. Families. Riders. Others walked. All came not to disturb the peace, but to add to it. They brought stories, tools, seeds. One elderly man carried a broken saddle, asking softly if it could be mended. They were answered not with speeches, but with hands. That night, there was no fire. Just a quiet meal shared on blankets spread across the grass. Horses nearby, laughter soft. Someone played a fiddle. No songs were planned, but voices rose in harmony anyway. Zeke sat among them, not above, not apart, just another steward. As the stars blinked alive above Boone Hollow, a young girl approached. She wore a small carved horse on a string around. She asked shyly. Zeke looked down at her. Tame them once. Can I hear it? He smiled. No, he said gently. You don't need to. She nodded, somehow understanding, and ran back toward her family. Zeke touched the whistle one last time, then slowly, quietly, he removed it from his neck. He stood, walked to the center of the field, and placed it on a stone where the wind could reach it. But no one would mistake it for something waiting to be used. It gleamed once in the moonlight, then stilled, because sometimes the most powerful whistle is the one you never have to blow again. And in Boone Hollow, where trust was planted, deeper than fence posts,